Chapter 3: Norm and Relation. Inasmuch as the wealth of capitalist society appears as a, quote, immense accumulation of commodities, end quote, so the society itself appears as an endless chain of legal relations. Commodity exchange presupposes an atomized economy. The link between isolated private economic units is maintained in each case by successfully concluded business deals. The legal relation between subjects is simply the reverse side of the relation between products of labor which have become commodities. This does not prevent certain jurists Petrajitsky, for one, from inverting things and believing, not that the commodity form produces the legal form, but that, on the contrary, the economic phenomenon studied by political economy, quote, represent people's individual and mass behavior, which is conditioned by a typical motivation emanating from the institution of civil law, the institutions of civil law, private property, law of obligations and contracts, family law, and law of inheritance, end quote. Petrajitsky. The legal relation is the cell form of the legal fabric. Only there does law accomplish its real movement. Compared to this, law as the aggregate of norms is merely a lifeless abstraction. It follows quite logically that the normative school headed by Kelsen should totally deny the relation between subjects refusing to study law. From this point of view, it follows quite logically that the normative school headed by Kelsen should totally deny the relation between subjects, refusing to study law from this point of view, and preferring to concentrate their undivided attention on the formal relevance of the norms. Quote, the legal relation is a relation for the purpose of the legal system, or, more correctly, the legal relation is a relation within the legal system, not a relation between legal subjects separate from the system of law, end quote. Hans Kelsen. Nonetheless, the current view holds that the legal relation is not only logical, but also in reality based on the norm or objective law. According to this notion, the legal relation is generated by the objective norm. Quote, it is not because creditors generally demand repayment of a debt that the right to make such demands exists, but on the contrary, the creditors make this claim because the norm exists. The law is not defined by abstraction from observed cases, but derives from a rule posited by someone. The expression, quote, the norm generates the legal relation, can be understood in two senses, real and logical. Let us consider the former. It must be noted above all, and the jurists themselves have tried often enough to assure one another of this, that the totality of written or unwritten norms actually belongs rather to the sphere of literary creation. This totality of norms only attains real meaning thanks to the relations which are thought to arise in conformity with these regulations, and do indeed arise in this way. Even the most consistent follower of the normative method, Hans Kelsen, had to admit that some part of real life, that is to say, of people's actual behavior, must in some way be injected into the ideal normative system. Indeed, only a person ripe for the madhouse would today regard the laws of Tsarist Russia as valid law. The formal juridical method, which is concerned only with norms, only with that, quote, which is according to law, end quote, can maintain its independence only within very narrow limits, and even then only so long as the tension between fact and norm does not exceed a certain maximum level. In material reality, the relation has primacy over the norm. If no debtor repaid his debts, the relevant regulation would have to be considered as non-existent in real terms. Should we wish to assert the existence of these regulations despite this, we would be forced to fetishize the norm in some way or other. A great many theories of law are concerned with just such fetishization, which they base on very subtle methodological considerations. Laws as an objective social phenomenon cannot be exhaustively defined by the norm or regulation, whether it be written or unwritten. Turning now to the logical content of the norm as such, it is either derived directly from relations already in existence, or if it is decreed by state law, it represents a mere symptom, from which one can infer with some probability the emergence of corresponding relations in the near future. Nevertheless, to assert the objective existence of law, it is not enough to know its normative content. Rather, one must know too whether this normative content materializes in life, that is, in social relations. The usual source of errors in this case is the legal dogmatist's way of thinking. For the legal dogmatist, the specific significance of the concept of the valid norm does not coincide with that which the sociologist or the historian understand by the objective existence of law. When the legal dogmatist has to decide whether or not a particular legal form is valid, most often he makes no attempt at all to ascertain whether a certain objective social phenomenon is present or absent, but only whether or not there is a logical connection between the given normative proposition and the more general normative premise. Thus, for the legal dogmatist, within the narrow bounds of his purely technical task, there really is nothing beyond the norms. He can therefore equate norm with law with the greatest equanimity. With regard to prescriptive right, he has to turn to reality, whether he likes it or not, whether the law of the state may be the highest normative prerequisite, or, to use the technical term, the source of law for the jurist. The legal dogmatist's view on, quote, valid law, are not in the least binding for the historian who wishes to study law as it actually exists. Scientific, that is, theoretical study, can reckon only with facts. If certain relations have actually come into being, this signifies that a corresponding law has arisen. However, if a law or decree has merely been promulgated without any corresponding relation having arisen in practice, then an attempt to create a law has indeed been made, but without success. This position is in no way synonymous with the negation of class will as a factor in development, or with renouncing intervention in this process of social development, with economism, fatalism, or any other such dreadful things. Revolutionary political action can achieve a great deal. Revolutionary political action can realize tomorrow that which does not yet exist today. But revolutionary political action cannot lend existence after the fact to something which did not actually exist in the past. Alternatively, if we assert that the intention to construct a building and even the plan for that building do not add up to the building itself, it does not follow from this that its construction necessitates neither intention nor plan. Yet if the matter has only got as far as the plan and no further, we cannot assert that the building has been erected. Moreover, one can modify somewhat the thesis that norm and law can be equated, and emphasize not the norm as such, but rather the objective regulative forces operating in a society, or, as the jurists put it, the objective legal system. Yet even this modified formulation of the thesis can be subjected to further criticism. If by socially regulative forces one means merely the same relations in their regularity and permanence, one has a simple tautology. But if under the heading one means a particular consciously organized system, which guarantees and safeguards these relations, then the fallacy becomes absolutely clear. Of course, one cannot assert that the relation between creditor and debtor is generated by the system of compulsory debt collection operating in the state in question. The objective existence of this system certainly guarantees and safeguards the relation, but it in no way creates it. That this is no mere scholastic semantic quibble can best be shown by the fact that one can conceive of very different degrees of perfection in the functioning of this external coercive social regulation, and consequently of the most varying degrees of guarantee of certain regulations, and can substantiate this with historical examples, without these relations themselves suffering the smallest variation in their substance. We can conceive of a borderline case in which, apart from the two parties relating to one another, no other third force can determine a norm and guarantee that norm's observance. For example, any contract of the Varangians with the Greeks. Even in this case, the relationship still remains in existence. Nevertheless, one need only imagine the disappearance of one of the parties, one of the subjects, as the representative of an autonomous separate interest, for the possibility of the relation itself to vanish too. It is possible to counter our view by saying that if one abstracts from the objective norm, the concepts of the legal relation and the legal subject themselves have no foundation and cannot be defined at all. This objection expresses the eminently practical, empirical spirit of modern jurisprudence, which has one firm conviction, namely that every trial would be lost if the plaintiff were not able to base his case on the relevant paragraph of some law or other. However, the conviction that subject and legal relation have no existence outside the objective norm is just as mistaken theoretically as the conviction that value does not exist and cannot be defined beyond supply and demand, because value is only manifested empirically in price fluctuations. The presently prevailing mode of legal thought, which gives pride of place to the norm as an authoritatively prescribed rule of conduct, is no less empiricist, and goes hand in hand, as can be observed in economic theories too, with an extreme formalism devoid of life. There can be supply and demand for anything you like, including objects which are not products of labor at all. From this it is inferred that value can be determined without reference to the socially necessary labor time required for the production of the object in question. The empirical fact of an individual evaluation is here used as the basis of the formal logical theory of marginal utility. In just the same way, the norms decreed by the state can concern the most diverse matters and can exhibit the most varied character. From this it is inferred that the essence of law is exhausted in the norms of conduct, or in the commandment emanating from a higher authority, and that the substance of social relations as such contains no elements especially conducive to the creation of the legal form. The formal logical theory of legal positivism is based on the empirical fact that the relations under state protection are the most secure. To use the terminology of the materialist conception of history, the question for analysis is reduced to the problem of the dialectical relationship between the legal and political superstructure. If we acknowledge that the norm is the primary element in every respect, we must first presuppose the existence of a norm-setting authority, of a political organization, in other words, before we start looking for a legal superstructure. In this way, we will inevitably reach the conclusion that the legal superstructure is a consequence of the political superstructure. However, Marx himself emphasizes the fact that the property relation, this most fundamental and lowest layer of legal superstructure, stands in such close contact with, quote, with the existing relations of production, end quote, that it, quote, is but a legal expression for the same thing, end quote. Marx. The state, that is, the organization of the political class dominance. The state, that is, the organization of political class dominance, stems from the given relations of production or property relations. The production relations and their legal expression form that which Marx, following in Hegel's footsteps, called civil society. The political superstructure, particularly official statum, is a secondary derived element. The following quotation illustrates Marx's conception of the relationship between civil society and the state. Quote, "The egoistic individual in civil society may in his non-sensuous imagination and lifeless abstraction inflate himself into an atom, i.e. into an unrelated, self-sufficient, wantless, absolutely full, blessed being. Unblessed, sensuous reality does not bother about his imagination. Each of his senses compels him to believe in the existence of the world and of individuals outside him. And even his profane stomach reminds him every day that the world outside him is not empty, but is what really fills. Every activity and property of his being, every one of his vital urges becomes a need, a necessity, which his self-seeking transforms into seeking for other things and human beings outside him. But since the need of one individual has no self-evident meaning for another egoistic individual, capable of satisfying that need, and therefore no direct connection with its satisfaction, each individual has to create this connection. It thus becomes the intermediary between the need of another and the object of this need. Therefore, it is natural necessity, the essential human properties, however estranged they may seem to be, and interest that hold the members of society together. Civil, not political life is their real tie. It is therefore not the state that holds the atoms of society together, but the fact that they are atoms only in imagination, in the heaven of their fancy, but in reality beings tremendously different from atoms, in other words, not divine egoists, but egoistic human beings. Only political superstition still imagines today that civil life must be held together by the state, whereas in reality, on the contrary, the state is held together by civil life. Marx. Holy Family. Marx returns to the same problem in another work, Moralizing Criticism and Critical Morality, in which he polemicizes against a representative of, quote, true socialism, Karl Heinzen. Quote, writing, quote, "Incidentally, if the bourgeoisie is politically, that is, by its state power, quote, maintaining injustice in property relations, the bourgeoisie is not creating it. The, quote, injustice in property relations, end quote, which is determined by the modern division of labor, the modern form of exchange, competition, concentration, etc., by no means arises from the political rule of the bourgeois class, but vice versa. The political rule of the bourgeois class arises from these modern relations of production, which bourgeois economists proclaim to be necessary and eternal laws." End quote. Marx. from moralizing criticism and critical morality. According to this, the distance from the production relation to the legal relation is shorter than the so-called positive According to this, the distance from the production relation to the legal relation is shorter than so-called positive jurisprudence thinks, unable as it is to do without a mediating connecting link, state authority and its norms. The precondition from which economic theory begins is man producing in society. The general theory of law, insofar as it is concerned with the fundamental definitions, should start from the same basic prerequisite. Thus, the economic relation of exchange must be present for the legal relation of contracts of purchase and sale to arise. Political power can, with the aid of laws, regulate, alter, condition, and concretize the form and content of this legal transaction in the most diverse manner. The law can determine in great detail what may be bought and sold, how, under what conditions, and by whom. From this, dogmatic jurisprudence concludes that all existing aspects of the legal relation, including the subject, are generated by the norm. In reality, the existence of a commodity and money economy is the basic precondition, without which all these concrete norms would have no meaning. Only under this condition does the legal subject have its material base in the person of the subject operating egoistically, whom the law does not create but finds in existence. Without this base, the corresponding legal relation is a priori inconceivable. The problem becomes clearer still when we consider it at the dynamic and historical level. In this context, we see how the economic relation in its actual workings is the source of the legal relation, which comes into being only at the moment of dispute. It is dispute conflict of interest which creates the legal form, the legal superstructure. In the lawsuit, in court proceedings, the economically active subjects first appear in their capacity as parties, that is, as participants in the legal superstructure. Even in its most primitive form, the court is legal superstructure par excellence. The legal differentiates itself from the economic and appears as an autonomous element through legal proceedings. Historically, law begins with dispute, that is, with the lawsuit. Only later did law embrace the proceeding, purely economic or practical relations, which thus from the very beginning assumed a double-edged economic legal aspect. Dogmatic jurisprudence forgets this sequence of events, proceeding directly from the end result, from the abstract norms with which the state fills, so to speak, the whole social domain. It acknowledges as legal only those actions which are undertaken within that domain. Corresponding to this oversimplified notion, the fundamental determining factor in the relation of borrowing and selling, borrowing, lending, and so forth, is thought to be not the actual economic content of these relations, but the imperative addressed to the individual in the name of society. This is the starting point of the practical jurist, which is just as useless for the analysis and explication of the concrete legal system as for the analysis of the legal form in its most general definitions. The state authority introduces clarity and stability into the structure of law, but does not create the premises for it, which are rooted in the material relations of production. As is well known, Gomplowitz reaches exactly the opposite conclusion. He proclaims the primacy of the state, that is to say, of political power. He turns his attention to the history of Roman law and imagines that he has proved that all private law arose, quote, as privileges of the ruling class, as public law preferences, end quote, whose purpose was to consolidate power in the hands of the victorious group. One cannot deny that this theory is persuasive to the extent that it emphasizes the element of class struggle and puts an end to idyllic notions as to the origin of private property and state power. Nevertheless, Gumplowitz makes two serious errors. Firstly, he attributes form-creating significance to power in itself, completely overlooking the fact that every social system, even one based on conquest, is conditioned by the state of its social productive forces. Secondly, in speaking of the state, Gumplowitz blurs the distinction between primitive power relations and, quote, public authority, end quote, in the modern, that is, the bourgeois sense. That is why it follows for Gumplowitz that private law is created by public law. Yet from the fact that the most important institutions of ancient Rome, jus civile, property, the family, order of inheritance, were created by the ruling class in order to consolidate their power, it is in fact possible to draw a conclusion which is diametrically opposed to Glumpowitz's, namely that, quote, all state law was once private law, end quote. This would be just as true, or rather just as false, since the contradistinction between public and private law corresponds to much more highly developed relations, and has little significance when applied to this primitive epoch. If the institutions of jus civile do actually present a mixture of public law and private law moments, to use modern terminology, then the institutions of the jus civile also contain to the same extent religious, and in the wider sense of the word ritual elements. Consequently, at this stage of development, it was not possible to discern the purely legal factor, let alone to express it in a system of general concepts. The development of law as a system was not predicated on the needs of prevailing power relations, but on the requisite requirements of trading transactions with peoples who were precisely not yet encompassed within a unified sphere of authority. Moreover, Glumpowitz himself admits this. Trade relations with foreign tribes, with resident aliens, plebeians, and in general with any persons not belonging to the public law association, to use Glumpowitz's terminology, called into being the jus gentium, that prototype of the legal superstructure in its purest form. Contrary to the jus civile, with its cumbersome forms, the jus gentium rejects everything which is not connected with the nature and purpose of the economic relation on which it is based. The jus gentium adapts itself to the nature of this relation, and consequently appears as a, quote, natural law. It strives to reduce this relation to the fewest possible premises, and thus effortlessly becomes a logically harmonious system. Gumplowitz is undoubtedly right to identify specifically juridical logic with the logic of the civil jurist, but Gumplowitz is mistaken in thinking that it was negligence on the part of the state power which enabled the system of private law to develop. Gumplowitz's train of thought was roughly this. In view of the fact that private lawsuits did not affect the interest of state power directly or materially, the interest of state power conceded to the ranks of the jurists complete freedom to sharpen their wits in this arena. In the sphere of constitutional law, on the other hand, the efforts of the jurist are usually cruelly foiled by reality. For state power does not tolerate any kind of interference in its affairs, and does not acknowledge the omnipotence of juridical logic. It is readily evident that the logic of juridical concepts corresponds to the logic of social relations of a commodity-producing society. It is precisely in these relations, and not in the permission of authority, that the roots of the system of private law should be sought. Yet the logic of the relations of dominance and subservience can only be partially accommodated within the system of juridical concepts. That is why the juridical conception of the state can never become a theory, but remains always an ideological distortion of the facts. Thus, wherever we have a primary layer of the legal superstructure, we find that the legal relation is directly generated by the existing social relations of production. It follows from this that it is unnecessary to start from the concept of the norm as external authoritative command in order to analyze the legal relation in the legal relation's simplest form. It is sufficient to base the analysis on a legal relation, quote, whose content is itself determined by the economic relation, end quote. Marx Capital. And then to investigate the, quote, statutory, end quote, form of this legal relation as a particular case. The question raised on the level of actual history as to whether the norm should be regarded as a prerequisite for the legal relation led us to the problem of the dialectical relationship between the legal and the political superstructure. In the logical and systematic realm, this question is posed as a problem of the relationship between subjective and objective law. In his textbook on constitutional law, Duguay draws attention to the fact that the same word, quote, law, is used to designate things, quote, which doubtless permeate one another deeply, but are at the same time very clearly differentiated, end quote. Here, Duguay is thinking of law in the objective and subjective sense. This is indeed one of the most obscure and most disputed points of the general theory of law. We are confronted by a strange dichotomy in the concept, whose twin facets, whilst they are to be found on different planes, undoubtedly complement one another. Law is simultaneously the form of external authoritarian regulation and the form of subjective private autonomy. In the one case, the fundamental substantive characteristic is that of unconditional obligation, of absolute external coercion, while in the other, it is the characteristic of freedom, guaranteed and recognized within certain limits. Law appears sometimes as a principle of social organization, and at other times as a means of enabling individuals, quote, to define themselves within society, end quote. On the one hand, law merges completely with the external authority, while on the other, it is just as completely opposed to every external authority, which does not acknowledge it, does not acknowledge law. Law is a synonym for official statedom, and law is the watchword of revolutionary struggle. This is the field of endless controversies and of the most unimaginable confusion. Acknowledging the profound contradiction implied here has led to many attempts to eliminate somehow this unwelcome cleavage of concepts, to sacrifice one of these two meanings to the other. Thus, the same Duguay, who in his textbook labels the expressions, quote, subjective law and objective law, end quote, as, quote, apposite, clear and exact, end quote, uses all his ingenuity in another work to prove that subjective law is simply based on a misconception, quote, a metaphysical conception which is untenable in an age of realism and positivism such as ours, end quote. The opposite tendency, represented in Germany by Bierling, and in Russia by the psychologist headed by Petrozitsky, tends, on the contrary, to portray objective law as, quote, an emotional projection, end quote, devoid of any real significance, as a phantasm, as the externalization of inner psychological processes, and so on. We shall bypass the psychological school and related tendencies for the moment, and concern ourselves with the notion that law should be grasped exclusively as an objective norm. If one starts from this conception, one has on the one hand the authoritative prescriptive ought as a norm, and on the other the subjective obligation created in conformity with this regulation. The dichotomy appears to have been completely eradicated. However, this suppression is only apparent, for no sooner does one come to apply this formula than attempts were renewed to reintroduce by subterfuge all the nuances which are indispensable to the concept of, quote, subjective law, end quote. We are confronted once again by the same two facets, only with the difference that one of the two facets, namely subjective law, is by all manner of subterfuge portrayed as a kind of shadow, for there is no possible combination of commands and obligations which would give us subjective law in the autonomous and perfectly real significance and the perfect for there is no possible combination of commands and obligations which would give us subjective law in the autonomous and perfectly real significance which it is personified by any one property owner in bourgeois society. Indeed, taking property as one's example makes this perfectly clear. For if the attempt to reduce property law to prohibitions against third parties is no more than a logical trick, a garbled construct turned inside out, then the portrayal of bourgeois property right as social obligation is hypocrisy to boot. Any property owner, as well as everyone around him, understands very well that the right to which he is entitled as a property owner has only so much in common with obligation. That is, Jesus Christ. Any property owner, as well as everyone around him, understands very well that the right to which he is entitled as a property owner has only so much in common with obligation that it is its polar opposite. Subjective law is the primary law, for subjective law is based, after all, on material interests, which exists independently of the external or conscious regulation of social life. The subject as representative and addressee of every possible claim, the succession of subjects linked together by claims on each other, is the fundamental legal fabric which corresponds to the economic fabric, that is, to the production relations of a society based on division of labor and exchange. A social organization with the means of coercion at its disposal is the concrete totality which we must arrive at after first comprehending the legal relation in its purest and simplest form. Consequently, when analyzing the legal form, obligations stemming from an imperative or a command seems to be a factor which concretizes and complicates things. Legal obligation, in its most abstract, simple form, should be seen as the reflection and correlation of the subjective legal claim. In analyzing the legal relation, it is abundantly clear that obligation cannot exhaust the logical content of the legal form. Indeed, it is not even an autonomous element of it. Obligation always figures as the reflection and correlate of right. One party's debt is something owed and guaranteed to the other party. Right from the creditor's point of view is obligation for the debtor. The category of law only becomes logically complete where it embraces the representative and bearer of right, whose rights are nothing but the obligations of others toward him. This dualistic nature of law is particularly emphasized by Petrozitsky, who gives it a fairly flimsy basis in the form of the psychological theory he invents ad hoc. However, it should be noted that this dialectical relationship of right and obligation has been very precisely formulated by other jurists, free of any psychologism. Thus the legal relation not only shows us law in its actual workings, but also reveals the characteristic traits of law as a logical category. In contrast to this, the norms as such, as a prescriptive ought, is as much an element of ethics, aesthetics, and technology as it is of law. Contrary to Alexiev's opinion, the difference between technology and law in no way resides in the fact that technology has a purpose external to its subject matter, whilst in the legal system every purpose must be posited as an end in itself. In what follows, it will be argued that the only, quote, end in itself for the legal system is commodity circulation. Let us look at the technique of a teacher or a surgeon. For the teacher, the child's psyche is his subject, while for the surgeon it is the organism of the person being operated on. But no one presumably would dispute the fact that the subject is also the purpose in these cases. The legal system differs from every other form of social system precisely in that the legal system deals with private isolated subjects. The legal norm acquires its differentia specifica, marking the legal norm out from the general mass of ethical, aesthetic, utilitarian, and other such regulations, precisely because the legal norm presupposes a person endowed with rights on the basis of which that person actively makes claims. The attempt to make the idea of external regulation the fundamental logical element in law leads to law being equated with a social order established in an authoritarian manner. This current in juridical thought accurately reflects the spirit of the age in which the Manchester School and free competition were superseded by the monopolies of large-scale capital and by imperialist policies. Finance capital sets much greater store on a strong arm and discipline than popping pills. Finance capital sets much greater store on a strong arm and discipline than on the, quote, eternal and inalienable rights of the individual citizen, end quote. The capitalist proprietor, transformed into the recipient of dividends and profits on speculations, cannot but regard the, quote, sacred right of property, end quote, with a certain cynicism. One need only refer to Earing's diverting lamentations about the, quote, mire of speculation and fraudulent stock jobbery, end quote, beneath which the, quote, healthy feeling for law, end quote, has been submerged. It is not difficult to establish that the idea of unconditional subjection to an external norm-setting authority has nothing whatever to do with the legal form. One need only look at examples of structures which take such a conception to the limit and are therefore particularly clear. Take the military unit set out in formation, where many people are subordinate in their motives to a common order in which the only active and autonomous principle is the will of the commander. Or take another example, the Jesuit order, in which all brothers of the order carry out the will of the superior blindly and without protest. One has merely to immerse oneself in these examples to reach the conclusion that the more consistently the principle of authoritarian regulation is applied, excluding all reference to separate autonomous wills, the less ground there remains for applying the category of law. This is particularly noticeable in the realm of so-called public law. It is here that legal theory encounters the most serious difficulties. Generally speaking, the law phenomenon that Marx characterized as the separation of the political state from civil society is reflected in the general theory of law as two independent problems, each of which has a particular place in the system and is resolved independently of the other. The first problem is purely abstract. It is the cleavage of the basic concept into two facets, which we have described above. Subjective law is the characteristic trait of the egoistic person, quote, as a member of civil society, an individual withdrawn into himself, into the confines of his private interests and private caprice, and separated from the community." End quote. Marx on the Jewish question. Objective law is the expression of the bourgeois state as a whole, which, quote, "feels itself to be a political state," and asserts the bourgeois state's universality only in opposition to these elements of its being. The problem of subjective and objective law is the general philosophical formulation of the problem of the individual as member of civil society and as citizen of a state. This problem comes up yet again, this time in more concrete form, as the problem of public law and private law. The problem is here reduced to delineating various spheres of law which actually exist, to distributing under various headings institutions which emerged historically. Dogmatic prejudice, with its formal logical method, can obviously solve neither the first nor the second problem, nor can it elucidate the connection between the two. The split into public and private law presents specific difficulties for this reason alone, that only in the abstract can one draw a line between the egoistic interest of man as a member of civil society and the abstract universal interest of the political whole. In reality, these elements are interdependent, so that it is impossible to elucidate the particular legal institutions which embody this much trumpeted private interest entirely in its pure form. In reality, these elements are interdependent, so that it is impossible to indicate the particular legal institutions which embody this much trumpeted private interest entirely and in pure form. Another difficulty is that even if the jurist manages to draw an empirical line between the institutions of public and private law more or less successfully, the jurist comes up against the identical problem again within the limits of each of these two domains. This problem, which had to all appearances been solved, appears this time in a somewhat different abstract formulation of as the contradiction between subjective and objective law. Subjective public rights, just the same old private rights again, and thus private interests too, resurrected and merely somewhat metamorphosed, intrude into a sphere in which the impersonal common interest, reflected in the norms of objective law, should hold sway. Yet while civil law, which is concerned with the fundamental primary level of law, makes use of the concept of subjective rights with complete assurance, application of this concept in public law theory creates misunderstandings and contradictions at every step. For this reason, the system of civil law is distinguished by its simplicity, clarity, and perfection, while theories of constitutional law teem with far-fetched constructs which are so one-sided as to become grotesque. The form of law, with its aspect of subjective right, is born in a society of isolated bearers of private egoistic interests. All economic life is to be built on the principle of agreement between autonomous wills. Every social function, in reflecting this, assumes a legal character. It is in the nature of political organization that it does not promote the full development of, nor does it have such paramount significance for, private interest as does the economic system of bourgeois society. Hence subjective public rights also appear as something ephemeral, lacking genuine roots, something eternally dubious. Yet at the same time the state is not a legal superstructure, but can only be conceived of as such. The theory of law cannot equate the rights of the legislature, those of the executive, and so on, with, for example, the right of the creditor to restitution of the sum borrowed from him. This would imply substituting isolated private interest for the dominance of the universal, impersonal interest of state assumed by bourgeois ideology. But at the same time, every jurist is aware of the fact that he cannot endow these rights with any other content, in principle, without the legal form slipping from his grasp altogether. Constitutional law is only able to exist.
Tom, dinner's ready.
Alright, I'll be in. As a reflection of the private law form in the sphere of political organization. Otherwise, it ceases to be law entirely. Every attempt to present a social function as it is, simply as a social function, and a norm simply as an organizational regulation, would mean the death of the legal form. The real prerequisite for such an abolition of the legal form and of legal ideology is, however, a society in which the contradiction between individual and social interest has been broken down. But the very thing which characterizes bourgeois society is that universal interests are disengaged from and set in opposition to private interests. In this antithesis, they themselves involuntarily assume the form of private interest, that is, legal form. As could be expected, the juridical factor in state organization are primarily those which can be adapted to the framework of conflicting, isolated private interests. Goichbarg even disputes the necessity for separating out the concepts of public and private law. Quote, "The jurists have never been successful in dividing law into public and private law, and this division is only recognized nowadays by the most reactionary jurists, ours included." End quote. Goichbarg further included. End quote. Goichbarg further substantiates this notion that it is unnecessary to divide law up into public and private law, with several observations. First, that the Manchester School principle of non-intervention in economic affairs by the state is outdated in the 20th century. Second, that unlimited individual choice in the economic sphere is detrimental to the interests of the whole. Third, that even in countries where there has not been a proletarian revolution, there are numerous structures which combine the realms of public and private law. Lastly, that in our country, where economic activity is, in the main, concentrated in the hands of state agencies, there is no longer any point in differentiating the concept of private from other concepts. It would seem that this line of argument rests on a whole series of misconceptions. The choice of one or other direction in practical politics does not decide anything with reference to the theoretical difference between certain concepts. We can be sure, for example, that the establishment of economic relations based on market transactions has many detrimental consequences. Nevertheless, it does not follow from this that the distinction between the concepts, quote, use value, end quote, and, quote, exchange value, end quote, is theoretically untenable. Neither would there be any point in reiterating the assertion that the spheres of public and private law merge, if one were unable to distinguish between these two concepts. How could entities which have no separate existence merge? Goichbarg's objections are based on the notion that the abstractions mentioned, quote, public law, and unquote, and private law, end quote, are not the product of historical development, but were simply dreamt up by the jurists. Yet it is precisely this contradiction which is the most typical attribute of the legal form as such. The division of law into public and private law characterizes this form from the historical as well as from the logical aspect. Positing this contradiction is simply non-existent, in no way makes one superior to the, quote, reactionary, end quote, practical jurists, scholastic definitions with which they operate. I'm going to eat now. Thus, the very concept of, quote, public law can only be developed through its workings, in which it is continually repulsed by private law. So much that public law attempts to define itself as the antithesis of private law, to which it returns, however, as to its center of gravity. The attempt to take the opposite course, to locate the fundamental definitions of private law, which are none other than the definitions of law itself, by starting out from the concept of the norm, can produce no result other than lifeless formal constructs, with ineradicable internal contradictions. Law as a function ceases to be law, while legal power, Berechtigung, without the supporting private interest, becomes something intangible and abstract, which can easily turn into its own opposite, that is, into obligation. Every public right is, of course, simultaneously obligation. Parliament's, quote, right to approve the budget is as unstable, problematic, and in need of interpretation as the, quote, creditor's right, end quote, to recover the sum lent by him is easily understood, and, quote, natural, end quote. Whereas in civil law, disputes are dealt with on the level called symptomatic of law. Here, the basis of jurisprudence itself is in question. Herein lies the source of the methodological wavering and uncertainty which threaten to transform jurisprudence sometimes into sociology, sometimes into psychology. On the basis of the above exposition, several of my critics, among them Ruzimovsky, Ilinsky, apparently thought that I had set myself the task of, quote, constructing a theory of pure jurisprudence, end quote. Ilinsky concluded that this task had remained unfulfilled. Quote, the author has produced a theory of law which is basically sociological, although he intended to construe it as pure jurisprudence, end quote. In Razumovsky's case, he expresses no definite opinion about my results, but neither does he question the existence of the above-mentioned intention, which he censors most severely. Quote, merely illustrates his... In Ruzimovsky's case, he expresses no definite opinion about my results, but neither does he question the existence of the above-mentioned intention, which he censures most severely. Quote, his, that is mine, Evgeny Pashukanis, is concerned that methodological analyses could transform jurisprudence into sociology or psychology, merely illustrates his inadequate conception of the nature of Marxist analysis. That is all the more mysterious, since Pashukanis himself sees a certain discrepancy between sociological and legal truth, and since he knows that the legal view is one-sided, end quote. Isaac Ruzimovsky. Yes, it is indeed strange. On the one hand, I am presumed to be afraid that jurisprudence will be transformed into sociology. On the other, I admit that the legal view is one-sided. On the one hand, I try to present a theory of pure jurisprudence, while on the other hand, it turns out that I have produced a sociological theory of law. How can these contradictions be resolved? The solution is very simple. As a Marxist, I did not set myself the task of constructing a theory of pure jurisprudence, nor could I set myself such a task. From the very first, I had a clear idea of the goal which Ilinsky says I have reached unconsciously. My aim was this, to present a sociological interpretation of the legal form and of the specific categories which express it. This is exactly why I gave my book the explanatory subtitle, Contribution to a Critique of the Fundamental Juridical Concepts. Indeed, my task would have been quite pointless were I to deny the existence of the legal form itself, and to discard the categories which express this form as idle fancies. When I describe the unreliability and inadequacy of juridical constructs in the field of public law, and in the process speak of the methodological vacillations and uncertainty, which threaten to transform jurisprudence sometimes into sociology, at others into psychology, is a strange idea to imagine that I mean thereby to warn against any attempt to carry out a sociological critique of jurisprudence from a Marxist standpoint. After all, such a warning would be directed primarily at myself. The presuppositions which elicited Ruzamovsky's amazement, and which he explains by my inadequate understanding of the nature of Marxist analysis, refer to the conclusions of bourgeois jurisprudence, whose conceptual structure loses all credibility as soon as it loses sight of the exchange relation, in the widest sense of the word. Perhaps I should have made it obvious by an explicit reference that phrase about the, quote, danger threatening jurisprudence, end quote, is an allusion to the lament of a bourgeois legal philosopher. The lament relates not to the Marxist critique, which had not yet ruffled the minds of the, quote, pure jurists, end quote, in those days, but to the attempts of bourgeois jurisprudence itself to mask the limitation of bourgeois jurisprudence's own method by borrowing from sociology and psychology. So far was it from my mind to imagine that I could be seen as a, quote, pure jurist, end quote, whose heart grieves for jurisprudence threatened by Marxist critique, that I did not take such precautionary measures.